The text came in on a Sunday morning right as I was pouring cream into my coffee. It wasn't from my sister, but from her best friend, an Instagram story bursting with sparkles and white lace. Counting down 2 weeks until Grace and Ethan's big day. The photo showed my sister in a bridal fitting twirling in front of a mirror, champagne flute in hand. My hand froze midair. 2 weeks. My sister's wedding. My stomach tightened as I checked the mailbox by my apartment door. Nothing. No invitation. No email. Not even a text. I dialed my mother's number before I could think. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice all sugar and strain, "Grace just wants everything to be perfect. You know how you can be intense." I heard laughter in the background, my sister's. "She'd probably ruin my perfect day," she said, not even bothering to whisper. The phone slipped slightly in my hand. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. Growing up, Grace was the princess and I was the afterthought. Our family looked perfect from the outside, a tidy home in Savannah, 2 daughters, in matching dresses, parents who smiled for every church photo. But behind the smiles, favoritism ruled every corner of that house. When Grace got a B, she was doing her best. When I got an A-, I was slipping. When she sang off-key in choir, everyone clapped. When I landed a scholarship to college, my mother said, "Good, 1 less tuition to worry about." I learned early that love in our house came with conditions: be soft, be agreeable, be like Grace. By the time I turned 33, I'd built a life that looked nothing like theirs. San Diego gave me distance, salt air, sunlight, and a career that finally made me proud of myself. I was the PR director for a tech firm, juggling press releases and product launches, living alone in a quiet condo overlooking the bay. My parents said they were proud too, but in the careful, detached way people praise a stranger. The real daughter, the golden one, was Grace. She'd majored in communications, quit every job she tried, and reinvented herself as a lifestyle influencer. A few filters, a sponsored candle line, and 1,000 compliments from Mom. Later, she was the success story. When Grace met Ethan, a young doctor from a well-known family, my parents behaved like they'd won the lottery. Dad started polishing the family silver again. Mom joined a wedding planning group online and dropped hints about finally having the daughter who does things right. Grace called once to brag about her ring, a diamond the size of a small ice cube. "It's nice," I said, trying to sound cheerful. She laughed. "Oh, Hannah, you wouldn't understand. It's the kind of thing you feel, not just see." I hung up before I said something that couldn't be unsaid. Still, I sent her a thoughtful engagement gift, a hand-painted frame engraved with her initials. No response. Weeks later, I saw the same frame in one of her videos labeled a fan gift. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Now, standing in my kitchen with the morning light pouring in and my sister's wedding photos flooding my phone, the years of small humiliations piled up all at once, I called again. This time, she answered, her tone bright and fake. "Hey, Hannah, what's up? I just saw something about your wedding," I said. "It's in 2 weeks. Yeah," she replied, voice lowering a notch. "It's kind of a small thing. Intimate, just close family." "I'm your sister," I said flatly. There was a pause. "I didn't think you'd want to come," she said finally. "You hate big gatherings. You didn't invite me," I said. Silence. Then laughter, light and cruel. "Don't take it personally, Hannah. You'd probably make things awkward. You know how you get." That line hit harder than it should have. You know how you get. Like my entire existence was a complication. I stayed quiet long enough for her to fill the silence. "Anyway," she said, "I've got to go. The florist's here." And she hung up. I called Mom next, praying for sanity. "Honey," she said after a long sigh, "please don't start drama. Grace deserves a stress-free wedding. Maybe you can send a nice card." "A card," I repeated. "I'm her only sister." "You're being emotional," she said, her voice tightening. "We just want this to be perfect." I thought I heard Dad in the background say, "Let it go, Hannah. Not everything's about you." When the line disconnected, I stood there staring at the blank screen. My reflection in the black glass looked unfamiliar, older, colder, someone I barely recognized. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the San Diego skyline shimmer across the water. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, grounding me just enough to feel the ache inside. All my life, I'd been the dependable one, the sister who sent money when Grace's rent was late, who helped pay Mom's hospital bills, who covered Christmas gifts when Dad's retirement check was delayed. But somehow, I was still the problem. I opened my laptop and scrolled through flight deals, more out of distraction than intention. A bright orange banner caught my eye, escape to Miami sun beaches and new beginnings. My finger hovered over the screen. I'd always said I'd visit Miami one day, just never when. Maybe now was the perfect time to disappear. As I booked the flight, I thought of Grace's words again. "You'd ruin my perfect day." I smiled for the first time in days, a small, dangerous smile. She wanted perfect. She'd get it, just not the way she planned. I spent the next morning packing a single suitcase, light clothes, sunglasses, and the old camera I hadn't touched in years. My assistant at work was shocked when I requested time off. "You never take vacations," she said. "Exactly," I replied. "It's time I start." On the way to the airport, I passed a wedding boutique with a new display in the window. A mannequin in a satin gown stood under twinkling lights, bouquet in hand. I stopped at the red light, staring at it, the irony sharp in my chest. For years I'd been the invisible daughter, the one who carried everyone else's burdens. Now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. Still, as the plane lifted off that evening, I felt something crack open inside me. Not pain exactly, but release. Savannah and all its ghosts shrank below the clouds, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if Grace would even notice I was gone. Probably not, I thought. Not until it's too late. By the time we landed in Miami, the city lights sparkled like scattered jewelry beneath the night sky. I breathed in the humid air, heavy with ocean and possibility. The hotel clerk smiled as she handed me my key card. "First time in Miami?" she asked. "First time anywhere that's mine," I said. Upstairs, I opened the balcony door to the sound of distant waves. Somewhere far away, my sister was probably posting another countdown, another smile for the camera, another layer of lies over the truth she thought no one knew. I poured myself a drink, stepped outside, and whispered into the warm air. Let's see how perfect she feels when the truth finally shows up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left waiting for an invitation. I was writing my own. The sound of the ocean woke me before the alarm did. Waves rolling against the sand, muffled laughter from the beach below, the scent of coffee drifting up from the hotel cafe. For a second, I felt weightless, free from everything I'd left behind in Savannah. Then I looked out from the balcony and saw a little girl sitting on her mother's lap at breakfast. The child was laughing, head thrown back, sticky fingers tangled in her mother's hair. The woman just smiled, patient, radiant. Something inside me cracked. I couldn't remember the last time my mother had looked at me that way. I thought coming to Miami would silence the past. But memories have a way of following you even across 1,000 miles. When Grace and I were little, people said we could have been twins. We had the same brown hair, same green eyes. But somehow everyone always saw her first. She smiled easier, softer, like she was made of light. I was the serious one. That was the word they used. Serious, never bright, never sweet. Grace was their sunshine. I was the cloudy day they tolerated until she came home from school. I still remember my 8th birthday. Mom baked a cake with pink frosting, roses all over the top. She said, "We'll save the big slice for Grace when she gets back from ballet." When Grace walked in, she was wearing a tiara from her recital. The cake was hers before I even blew the candles out. I watched her open my present, a silver hairbrush set. "Because you'll just lose it, Hannah." I smiled, but that night I cried into my pillow until the smell of frosting made me sick. Mom always said I was stronger. When I fell off my bike, she didn't run to me. She shouted from the porch, "You're fine, get up." But when Grace scraped her knee, Mom dropped everything. There was antiseptic kisses, soft words. I told myself it didn't matter, that maybe love came in different shapes. But even as a kid, I knew some shapes fit better than others. Dad wasn't cruel, just absent. He worked long hours at the insurance firm and came home tired, half listening. He laughed at Grace's stories, praised her drawings, called her sweetheart. With me, it was keep it up, kiddo, or don't overdo it. I became addicted to earning gold stars, straight A's, anything that made me visible. Every report card was a plea for acknowledgement, a desperate whisper of, "See me too." By the time high school rolled around, the difference was a canyon. Grace joined cheerleading. Mom called her my little celebrity. I joined debate team and won regionals, but they forgot to show up for the finals. When I got home that night with my trophy, the kitchen table was covered in shopping bags. "Sorry, honey," Mom said. "We lost track of time." Grace needed a new dress for the banquet. I told her it was okay. I said that a lot back then. College was my first act of rebellion. I applied to the University of Washington just to get as far away from Georgia as possible. When the acceptance letter arrived, Mom didn't even open it. She just said, "You'll miss us. Grace can't imagine the family without you." Grace rolled her eyes behind her. "Speak for yourself," she muttered, and Mom laughed. I left 2 months later with one suitcase and a head full of resolve. No one drove me to the airport. Grace posted a photo that day, her and Mom hugging, captioned "family time." Before the big week, I wasn't even in the frame. I worked 3 jobs through college, tutoring, waiting tables, managing the front desk of a motel on weekends. Mom called once every few weeks, usually to complain about bills or Grace's latest crisis. "She's sensitive," Mom would say. "She just needs more love." That sentence followed me through the years like a curse. Grace needed more love, so I had to need less. Grace needed attention, so I had to settle for respect. Grace needed saving, so I had to be the rescuer. The irony was that the rescuer was the one who drowned. When Mom had surgery my senior year, I wired money for the hospital copay, even though it emptied my savings. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she said, "Grace stayed at the hospital all night, you know." That's real love. I remember holding the phone in silence, biting my lips so hard I tasted blood. After graduation, I landed my first job in Chicago. Grace moved back home, started a YouTube channel about wellness and positivity. Within months, she had sponsors, free skincare, and an army of followers. I sent flowers for her first brand partnership. She didn't respond, but a week later, Mom posted, "So proud of my Grace," I was tagged nowhere. That pattern never changed. Holidays were the worst. At Christmas, I'd fly home, gifts in hand, only to find Grace had taken over the living room with her lights, her music, her fiancé of the month. I was the guest who arrived late to her show. One year, I brought Mom a silver necklace. Grace gasped and said, "Oh, I bought her the same thing but in gold." Mom wore Grace's the rest of the night. Now, sitting in the cafe downstairs in Miami, I stirred my coffee and watched the foam dissolve. The smell of roasted beans reminded me of the mornings in Savannah when I'd sit in the kitchen before school. Grace would sleep in while I packed my own lunch. Mom always said, "You're so independent, Hannah." I used to think it was a compliment. Now it sounded like a sentence. I pulled my journal from my bag and opened to a blank page. The words came slow then, all at once. "I have spent 33 years trying to be someone worth loving. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's them." Outside, the sky shimmered like liquid glass. A couple walked by hand in hand. I wondered if Grace would ever see how deeply she'd been shaped by the family that idolized her. Or maybe she already knew, and that was the cruelty. She liked it that way. When people call you strong long enough, they forget you can break. They assume your silence is comfort, your distance is choice. But silence is just what happens when no one listens anymore. I thought of one night years ago when Grace came crying to my dorm room after another fight with her boyfriend. She had nowhere else to go. I let her in, made her tea, stayed up until dawn, calming her down. In the morning, she hugged me and said, "You're the only one who understands me." 2 days later, she posted a photo with him, captioned, "Perfect couple forever." I was erased again. The waitress came by with a refill. "You all right?" she asked softly. I forced a smile. "I'm fine," I said. I'd been saying that for decades. Back in my hotel room, I stood before the mirror studying the woman I'd become. My hair pulled back, eyes tired but still sharp. The kind of woman people mistake for being unshakable. I touched the glass where my reflection stared back and whispered, "Even strong things crack." The afternoon sun turned everything gold. I stepped onto the balcony, journal still open in my hand. The page fluttered in the wind. "Grace just needs more love. You're stronger." Mom's words echoed again. Maybe that was the moment everything had broken, the day I accepted that love had to be earned. A gull soared overhead, dipping low toward the ocean. For the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to stop earning and just exist. I closed the journal and leaned against the railing, feeling the heat on my skin. I told myself I'd come to Miami to forget the wedding, but forgetting wasn't healing. Healing meant remembering without the pain swallowing me whole. Somewhere out there, Grace was trying on her dress again, smiling into a camera, building the illusion of perfection. I almost pitied her. Almost. Because perfection built on lies always cracks. My phone buzzed on the table inside. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. The preview read, "You don't know me, but you should hear what your sister's been hiding." I stared at it, the sound of the waves fading into nothing. The coffee went cold in my hand. So maybe after all these years, the universe had decided to show me that even the golden child bleeds. And for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't feel weak. I felt ready. The message glowed on my phone screen, pale blue against the dark. "You don't know me, but you should hear what your sister's been hiding." For a moment, I thought it had to be a scam. Miami was full of random numbers, spammers, tourists, people selling boat rides. But something about the phrasing made my pulse quicken. "My sister's been hiding." I stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, the wind pushed the balcony curtains inward like a slow breath. I typed back before I could second-guess myself. "Who is this?" No reply. I tried again. "What are you talking about?" Nothing. Hours passed. I turned off the lights, curled up in bed, and told myself not to care. But sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grace's face, smiling, untouchable, smug. I thought about her saying, "You'd ruin my perfect day," and the old anger began to stir again. The phone buzzed just past midnight. "You deserve to know before it's too late." My heart thudded. Too late for what I texted. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then, check your email. I sat up, flipped open my laptop, and logged in. A new message waited in my inbox, subject line, "Truth." My fingers hovered above the keyboard. For one long breath, I almost deleted it. Then curiosity, poisonous, irresistible, took over. Inside was a single sentence: "She's not who he thinks she is." Below it, 3 attachments. The first was a screenshot of text messages, Grace's number unmistakable, the same bubbly speech patterns she used on Instagram captions. The conversation was between her and a man named S. She called him baby and wrote things like, "I miss your hands." The date stamp was from last week. The second attachment was worse, a photo of Grace in a car leaning across the console to kiss someone. The angle was grainy but clear enough to show her face. The man beside her wasn't Ethan. The third attachment was a bank transaction, a $5,000 wire transfer from Grace's account to someone named Sean Turner. I sat frozen, the glow of the screen washing over me. The ocean outside seemed to grow louder, as if it were roaring through the room. Sean Turner. I knew that name. 2 years ago, he'd been a marketing consultant at my firm. Tall, charming, reckless. I'd introduced him to Grace at a charity gala. She'd spent that whole night giggling at his jokes while I presented our company's new campaign. 2 months later, he quit. A year later, he reappeared on Grace's social media, tagged in photos from New York, then gone again. My stomach turned. I wrote back to the unknown number. "Who are you? How did you get these?" "Someone tired of her lies," came the reply. You're not the only one she's used. I reread every line of that message, letting the truth sink in. Grace was cheating on her fiancé, 2 weeks before the wedding. And whoever this was, they wanted me to know. I closed my laptop and pressed my palms over my face. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I laughed, a short, broken sound that startled even me. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, and here it was, finally, the evidence that their perfect girl was nothing but a fraud. But then came the second wave, the moral one. Did I really want to expose her? To humiliate my sister even after everything she'd done to me? I thought of Ethan, the fiancé, probably planning his vows right now, rehearsing promises she'd already broken. My phone buzzed again. Do what you want with the truth, but hurry. She's good at covering tracks. I stared at the screen. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "You could just delete everything. Pretend you never saw it. Go back to your beach chair and your cocktails and your carefully rebuilt peace." But another voice, the older one, the one that had lived through every dismissal, every backhanded compliment, every forgotten birthday, said no. Not this time. I spent the rest of the night going over every photo, every timestamp. The images weren't faked. I checked the metadata on the files taken 3 nights ago in Savannah. The license plate in the background matched Grace's car. The man's watch, a sleek silver band I remembered from our office farewell party, confirmed what I already knew. The betrayal was real. By sunrise, the sky had turned a faint rose over the Atlantic. I poured coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake up. My reflection looked calm, almost serene. But inside, something was shifting. For the first time in years, I wasn't the helpless one. I had information, leverage, truth. I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it Truth. Then I copied the files inside. The phone rang again around 8. It was Ashley, my friend from Chicago. "How's paradise?" she asked. I hesitated. "It's interesting. You sound weird. Are you okay?" "Better than I've ever been," I said. "Just thinking." She laughed. "Thinking in Miami, dangerous combination. Call me when you get into trouble." When we hung up, I stared at my reflection again. Trouble. That word fit perfectly. I needed to know why this stranger had reached out. I scrolled through the text thread again, reading every word. The phrasing was careful, almost formal, like someone trying not to reveal too much. Maybe it was Sean himself. Maybe Ethan's friend. Or maybe someone from Grace's little influencer circle, someone she'd hurt. Whoever it was, they wanted her exposed. The question was, did I? I opened a blank page and started typing. "Dear Ethan," I wrote, then stopped. My fingers hovered, uncertain. I imagined his face when he read those messages, the way his jaw would tighten, the way Grace would twist the story into something else. She'd done it before. When I was 25, Grace dated my coworker behind my back. When it came out, she told everyone I was jealous. People believed her because Grace always looked like the innocent one. That scandal cost me a promotion. She'd smiled through it unscathed. Not this time. I deleted the half-finished email and instead drafted a list: names, dates, screenshots, bank transfers. A clean, undeniable trail. I wasn't sure what I would do with it yet, but the act of organizing felt powerful, almost sacred. Around noon, I walked down to the hotel pool. Families splashed in the shallow end. The air smelled of coconut lotion and salt. I sat with my notebook and let the sun warm my skin. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange clarity. Grace had spent her whole life teaching me that silence kept the peace. Maybe it was time to teach her that truth could shatter it. Still, part of me hesitated. I wasn't cruel. I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. What I wanted was balance, a reckoning that matched the years of humiliation. I thought of Mom saying she just needs more love. Maybe she did. But love without honesty was poison, and I was done drinking it. The waves rolled louder, faster. Somewhere a gull screamed overhead. I imagined Grace standing at the altar, veil, perfect smile, flawless, the entire town watching. and then Ethan opening an envelope. Seeing the photos, the truth spilling out like sunlight through stained glass, the image was terrible and it was beautiful. I picked up my phone, opened the messages, and typed, "What do you want from me?" The reply came within seconds. "If you want to see more, meet me tomorrow, Bayshore Cafe, 10 a.m. Don't tell anyone." The screen dimmed, leaving me staring at my own reflection again. The calm surface of the water outside shimmered in the afternoon light, but beneath it I could feel something deeper stirring, an undertow, pulling me toward the inevitable. I closed the phone and whispered to no one. "Okay, Grace, you wanted perfect. Let's see how perfect you are when the truth walks in." The next morning Miami shimmered under a thin film of humidity. Sunlight bounced off the cars crawling along Bayshore Drive, the air already thick with the smell of salt and roasted coffee. My cab pulled up in front of Bayshore Cafe, a small corner spot with faded teal awnings and wooden tables facing the water. Tourists in linen shirts sipped cappuccinos, laughing over pastries. It looked like the last place anyone would come to talk about betrayal. I sat near the back, ordered black coffee, and kept my sunglasses on. Every few seconds I glanced at the door. Part of me still thought this might be a prank. Another part, the part that hadn't stopped replaying those photos, knew better. 10 minutes passed before a man walked in. Mid-30s, brown hair tucked under a baseball cap, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. He scanned the room, spotted me, then headed straight for my table. He didn't ask before sitting. "You came," he said, voice low. "Clearly," I replied. "You must be the stranger who likes dramatic texts." A faint smile. "Mark." He extended a hand, but I didn't take it. He nodded as if expecting that. "I don't do games, Mark." "Who are you really?" "I used to work with Ethan. We were friends, still are, sort of. I sent you the email." The name hit like a pulse. "Ethan, my sister's perfect fiancé. The one Mom called a real catch." "You're friends with him," I said. "And you're sending me proof his fiancé's cheating on him." He stirred the sugar into his coffee slowly. I tried sending it to him first. He blocked me. Thought I was jealous. "Are you?" His jaw tightened. "I dated Grace once, briefly, before she met him." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "So this is revenge?" "No," he said quickly. "It's regret. I should have warned him earlier." Something in his tone stopped me from walking out. He wasn't defensive, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from knowing the truth too long. "She's not who she says she is, Hannah. I think you know that better than anyone." The way he said my name made my stomach twist. "You looked me up. I had to make sure you were real before contacting you." He reached into his backpack and placed a small flash drive on the table. "Everything's on there. Photos, videos, voice notes. She's been seeing Sean for months." The name made my chest go cold. "Sean Turner," he nodded. "You know him." I let out a breath that came out like a laugh. "You could say that. I hired him once. Mark studied me." "Then you know what kind of person he is." I shook my head. "I know what kind of person my sister is. She attracts men who see mirrors, not people." He didn't argue. Instead, he pushed the flash drive closer. "Take it. Do what you think is right." I didn't touch it. "Why involve me? Why not go to Ethan again?" "Because he'll believe you," Mark said. "He knows your family. He knows you have nothing to gain." I almost laughed. "You clearly don't know my family." Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Look, I get it. You're angry. Maybe even done with them. But Ethan's a good man. He doesn't deserve this." I looked out the window where sunlight scattered across the bay like broken glass. "And you think I do?" He hesitated. "I think you deserve to stop carrying their lies." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The cafe filled with the sound of cups clinking, tourists chatting, a soft melody humming through the speakers. Somewhere, a boat engine revved, cutting across the silence between us. I reached for the flash drive. "If this is fake, if any of this is edited," "It's not," he interrupted. "Check the timestamps." The hotel's security camera footage is dated last week. They spent the weekend together in Tybee Island. Ethan was on call at the hospital. She told him she was visiting a friend in Atlanta. My throat went dry. I'd grown up hearing Grace's lies dressed as stories, but this was different. This was criminal, almost surgical in its precision. Mark took a sip of his coffee. "You should see this before you decide anything." He pulled out his phone, scrolled, then turned the screen toward me. The video played without sound. Grace in a white sundress, laughing, leaning against a hotel balcony. Sean's arm around her waist. They kissed. He said something, and she threw her head back, laughing, like she'd never had a care in the world. I pushed the phone away. "That's enough." "I'm sorry," Mark said softly, "but you needed to see it." I nodded, swallowing hard. "You have copies." "Yes, but I'm not releasing them." "That's not my place." "Then why send them to me?" "Because it's yours." The sentence hung between us like a verdict. I sat there, fingers gripping the coffee cup, feeling the heat seep into my palms. "I don't know what you think I can do," I said. "Tell the truth. To him. To whoever deserves to hear it." I stared at the small silver flash drive on the table. It looked harmless, almost innocent, like a bullet before it's fired. Mark checked his watch and stood. "I've got to go. My flight's in 2 hours." "We're back to Savannah," he said. "I'm not staying for the fireworks." He hesitated, then added, "Be careful. She's not just manipulative, she's smart. She'll twist anything you say." He left without waiting for me to reply. I sat there long after he disappeared, watching the waves brush against the dock. The world kept moving ordinary and bright, while inside me, something dark began to solidify. Back in my hotel room, I plugged in the flash drive. Files filled the screen: images, recordings, text logs. Grace's voice in one of the clips, low and teasing. "He'll never find out. Trust me. Ethan's too busy saving lives." My hands trembled. I pressed pause. For years I'd carried the shame of being the difficult sister, the one who couldn't just be happy for Grace. Now I realized my instincts had been right all along. The truth had been rotting under the surface, and everyone had chosen to look away. I walked to the balcony, staring down at the stretch of ocean. The waves glittered in the midday sun, endless and unforgiving. I thought of Ethan, how kind he'd seemed at family dinners, how sincerely he'd once thanked me for helping Grace plan her engagement photos. "She's lucky to have you," he'd said. I'd smiled, then not knowing he was the one who needed saving. Mark's words echoed in my head. "You'd be saving him. Saving him or destroying her, maybe both." The truth was a blade. No matter who held it, someone was bound to bleed. I picked up my phone and opened the gallery of screenshots again. Every pixel felt like proof and punishment at once. Grace with her glossy hair and fake laughter. Grace, the adored daughter, the one who never got her hands dirty until now. The hotel phone rang, startling me. I let it ring twice before answering. "Miss Miller," the concierge said. "Just confirming your flight to Savannah tomorrow evening. Would you like to upgrade to business class?" I didn't remember booking it, but then again, I didn't remember deciding half the things I'd done that day. My voice came out steady. "Yes, upgrade it." When I hung up, I caught my reflection in the glass door. My face looked calm, composed, but my eyes were sharp. Grace had wanted me gone from her wedding. She'd made sure of it. Now I was coming back, not to ruin her perfect day, but to make sure she finally lived in the world she created. That night, I packed my suitcase again. The same clothes, the same perfume, the same camera. But the woman folding them wasn't the same one who'd arrived here 3 days earlier. I slid the flash drive into a small envelope, sealing it with a strip of tape. On the front, I wrote a single word: truth. As I turned off the light, the city outside still glimmered like it was alive, whispering promises through the palm leaves. I lay down, eyes open, the sound of the surf mingling with my thoughts. Grace wanted perfection. She'd get it, just not the way she imagined. Tomorrow I was going home. The plane dipped through a layer of soft clouds, and Savannah unfolded beneath me: green marshes, winding rivers, rooftops glowing under the southern Sunday. I hadn't seen this view in years, not since the day I swore I'd never come back. From above, it all looked so peaceful. But peace had never lived in that town, not for me. The city looked unchanged. The only difference was me. When I stepped off the plane, the air hit me, with the heavy scent of magnolias and humidity, thick and nostalgic. I rented a car and drove toward the old neighborhood past the church, where we used to go every Sunday, past the bakery where Grace got her first job and quit after 3 days, past everything I'd once tried to belong to. Every street held a memory I didn't ask to revisit. The Miller house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its white porch and blue shutters freshly painted. Mom had probably ordered new flowers for the wedding. The front yard looked like a magazine cover. I parked, took a deep breath, and rang the bell. The door opened after a few seconds. Mom stood there in a floral apron holding a wooden spoon. For a second, her eyes widened as if she'd seen a ghost. "Hannah," she said, voice tight. "What are you doing here?" I smiled faintly. "Thought I'd surprise you. Big weekend, right?" Her lips twitched into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, well, we weren't expecting." Dad's voice floated from inside. "Who's at the door?" Mom hesitated before answering. "It's your daughter." He appeared behind her, older but unchanged, same stern jaw, same air of quiet disappointment. "This is a surprise," he said. "Everything all right in California?" "Everything's fine," I said. "Just wanted to wish Grace happiness, that's all." They exchanged a look I knew by heart, the silent conversation of parents deciding how to handle the difficult child. "Of course," Mom said finally. "Come in. But don't say anything that might upset her. She's under a lot of stress." "Of course," I repeated. Inside the house smelled of vanilla candles and lilies. Wedding chaos filled every corner, boxes of decor, white ribbons, catering checklists taped to the fridge. Grace's laughter echoed from upstairs, bright and rehearsed. When she came down, she froze mid-step. "Oh, you actually came." Her words were coated in sugar, but the surprise in her eyes was real. She looked flawless, perfect curls, manicure glow of someone who'd never worked a hard day in her life. I smiled, calm and even. Wouldn't miss it for the world. She hesitated before descending the rest of the stairs, holding a crystal flute of orange juice like she was in a commercial. "Well, that's nice. We didn't think you'd want to be part of all this. It's kind of, formal." "I can behave," I said softly. Grace laughed. "Sure you can. Mom, did you know she was coming?" Mom busied herself arranging flowers. "Not exactly. But it's wonderful, isn't it?" Dad cleared his throat. "Let's make sure there's no tension this weekend. Grace deserves a stress-free celebration." "Right," Grace said, smiling wider. "No tension." She started walking me through the house, pointing out every detail like a hostess. The ceremonies at the lake pavilion, then dinner under the lights. 200 guests. "Can you believe it? Ethan's parents are flying in tonight?" I nodded, pretending to admire the floral arrangements. "It's beautiful. You must be exhausted." "Oh, I have people for that," she said, laughing. "You know how it is when you're planning something this big. Details, details." I followed her voice but watched her hands. They trembled slightly when she lifted her glass. Beneath the surface polish, she was nervous. She had every reason to be. Later, I walked through the backyard while they discussed menu options. The garden looked smaller than I remembered. A white tent stretched across the lawn, fairy lights strung along the fence. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the river. "Didn't think I'd see you here." I turned. Ethan stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard and wearing a faint smile. His sleeves were rolled up, tie loosened, as if he'd been working since dawn. He looked exactly the same, steady, kind, the kind of man who made people feel safe. "Hi," I said. "Wedding planner making you earn your vows already." He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Something like that." Grace wanted everything perfect. "You know how she gets." "I do." He looked at me for a moment, studying my face. "I'm glad you came, Hannah. I always thought you'd be here." "Did you?" I asked. "Of course. Your family." The words stung more than I expected. "Am I He frowned slightly. She loves you in her own way. Grace just has a hard time showing it. Yeah, I said, I noticed. He smiled again, though it didn't reach his eyes. Anyway, it'll mean a lot to her that you're here. I wanted to tell him everything. That his bride-to-be was cheating, that the photos were real, that I had proof in my bag. But I looked into his kind face and couldn't do it, not yet. Timing mattered. Truth needed the right stage, and the curtain hadn't risen. Instead, I said, "Are you happy, Ethan?" He hesitated, surprised by the question. "I think so. Grace makes life exciting. Never boring, that's for sure." Exciting. The word tasted ironic. I smiled, said goodbye, and walked back toward my car before I said something unforgivable. At the hotel that evening, I stood by the window watching the river turn to silver under the moon. The city buzzed faintly in the distance. I set my bag on the bed and pulled out the small envelope. The word truth stared back at me in my own handwriting. I placed it on the table next to a note card I'd picked up from the wedding invitation display. Tomorrow I would decide where it belonged. The air conditioner hummed softly as I poured a glass of water. I could still hear Grace's voice echoing through the house earlier, high, bright, full of control. She'd looked untouchable in her perfect white dress, but her eyes had betrayed her. She was afraid. Maybe she didn't know exactly what of, but she could feel it coming. I opened my journal and began to write, "Tomorrow my sister will have her perfect day. I'll just make sure it's honest." For the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. The lies that had trapped me my whole life were now mine to expose or contain. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. A new message flashed from the same unknown number that had sent me the first email. "He deserves to know before he says I do." I read it twice, my pulse steady. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the marshes. The storm was coming. I turned off the lamp and lay back, staring at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow would decide everything for her, for him, and for me. Grace wanted perfection. Tomorrow she'd get the truth instead. The morning of the wedding broke bright and cloudless, the kind of golden savanna day that photographers prayed for. Sunlight spilled through my hotel window, painting the white sheets in gold. I'd been awake for hours, watching the light crawl across the floor, the sealed envelope lying on the nightstand beside me. The word I'd written on it in black ink, "Truth," looked small, almost harmless. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft blue dress that didn't stand out but still looked deliberate. My hands didn't shake when I picked up the envelope. I slipped it into my purse and checked my reflection in the mirror. Calm, composed, the kind of face that didn't belong to the woman who once begged for her family's approval. Outside, the streets were alive with excitement. Cars lined up along the lake road, florists rushing with bouquets, waiters carrying trays of champagne. The Miller name carried weight in Savannah, and Grace had made sure her wedding would be the kind of spectacle people would gossip about for years. When I arrived, the lake pavilion looked like something out of a movie, rows of white chairs, ribbons fluttering in the breeze, the water shimmering behind an archway of orchids. The guests were already gathering, laughing, posing for photos. Everything glowed with that curated perfection Grace lived for. She spotted me as soon as I stepped onto the grass. Her expression faltered, then reassembled itself into a smile polished enough for the cameras. "Oh," she said, voice light. "You came after all." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. "You look decent," she added, as if the compliment cost her. "You too," I said, and her smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Mom appeared at her side, fussing with the hem of Grace's veil. "Try not to cause a scene," she whispered to me without looking up. "Today isn't about you." It used to sting when she said things like that. Today it didn't. I just smiled. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm perfectly quiet." Inside the pavilion, the air smelled of perfume and lilies. The hum of conversation filled every corner. Old family friends, business partners, people I hadn't seen since childhood. Everyone congratulating themselves for being part of the perfect day. I found a seat near the back where I could see everything but no one could see me. Grace floated around the guests, her laughter loud practiced. Ethan stood near the altar, talking to his best man, looking impossibly steady in a charcoal suit. There was a softness in his eyes I hadn't noticed before, gentle, honest, undeserving of what was about to happen. When the music started, the crowd hushed. Bridesmaids glided down the aisle in pale pink. Then came the pause, the collective inhale. Grace appeared at the top of the path, framed by sunlight, her dress shimmering like water. People sighed. Someone whispered, "She looks like an angel." I watched her glide forward, every step calculated, every glance rehearsed. The angel everyone adored. And all I could think was, let's see if angels can bleed. When she reached the altar, Ethan took her hand. For a moment they looked like perfection itself. Then I saw it, the small envelope in his other hand, cream-colored, my handwriting faintly visible on the front. Grace noticed too. "What's that?" she asked, softly, still smiling for the audience. He looked down at it, then back at her. "Something that was delivered to me before the ceremony." Her smile faltered. "Probably from a guest, maybe," he said. His voice was calm, but I saw the tension in his jaw. He slid a finger under the seal. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace's eyes flickered toward me, and for the first time since childhood I didn't look away. Ethan unfolded the note. He read the single sentence, lips moving silently. Then he looked at Grace. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She blinked, confusion painted perfectly across her face. "What do you mean?" He reached for the laptop connected to the sound system. "You'll understand." Grace's voice rose tight. "Ethan, stop. This isn't funny." But it was too late. The speakers crackled, and the projector screen behind them came alive. The first image appeared: Grace in a white sundress, her arms around Sean on a balcony. Laughter, a kiss. The date stamp in the corner, unmistakable last week. The sound of shock rippled through the guests. Someone gasped. A glass shattered. The music cut off completely. Grace spun toward Ethan. "It's fake," she shouted. "Someone edited that. They're trying to ruin me." Ethan's face was pale, rigid. "Who's Sean Turner?" she stammered. "A friend." "It's not." A man rose from the audience. "Mark, I hadn't known he'd come." "He's not a friend," Mark said, his voice clear. "She's been lying for months. I tried to tell you, Ethan." Ethan stared at Grace. "Is it true?" She shook her head violently. "No, they're all jealous. You can't believe them." But the room had already turned on her. Guests whispered, cameras, still rolling faces, frozen between fascination and horror. Mom covered her mouth. Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Grace tried to step forward, but her heel caught on the hem of her dress. She stumbled, clutching at Ethan's sleeve. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You have to believe me. It was a mistake." He stepped back. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary, Grace. This is betrayal." The microphone fell from his hand, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Grace's breath came in ragged gasps. "You can't do this to me. Not in front of everyone." Ethan looked at her one last time. "You did this to yourself." Then he turned and walked down the aisle, past the stunned crowd, past the flashing cameras, straight out the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace collapsed to her knees, sobbing, her pristine white dress spreading across the floor like spilled milk. I stood up slowly. Around me, people began whispering, "Who sent it? How did he find out?" But their voices were distant, muffled. I walked down the side aisle, my heels quiet on the wooden floor. When I reached the open doorway, the air outside hit me like a cool wave. I looked back once. Grace was still on the floor, her hair undone, her crown slipping. Mom knelt beside her, whispering useless words. Dad just stared motionless. The lake glittered behind them, reflecting everything that had just shattered. I stepped out into the sunlight. The wind carried the faint echo of chaos from inside, but all I felt was stillness. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the problem. I wasn't invisible. I was free. No one would ever know it was me. But as I walked toward the water heels sinking slightly into the soft grass, I realized I didn't care anymore. The truth had done what I never could. It made them see. Behind me, someone called my name, but I didn't turn around. The sun was warm on my face, the world sharp and clear. Grace had wanted her perfect day. And she got it, just not the way she planned. The rain started sometime before dawn, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the hotel window like an old clock. I lay awake, listening, the sound somehow fitting. Yesterday had been fire. Today was water washing away what was left. My phone blinked on the nightstand, lighting the room in pale blue intervals. Notifications stacked endlessly, texts, missed calls, voicemails. I didn't need to open them to know what they said. When I finally reached for the phone, the first thing I saw was a headline: local influencer's wedding ends in chaos. Below it, a still image: Grace on the floor, her white gown soaked, mascara running down her cheeks. Another headline read: betrayal caught on camera. The clip from the ceremony had leaked online and was everywhere. I pressed play once, only to hear the faint sound of gasps and the crash of a wine glass before I turned it off. I didn't need to see it again. The comments were a mix of fascination and disgust. "Serves her right," one said. "Poor guy," said another. I scrolled a bit more before setting the phone face down. Justice, it turned out, was loud. By noon, every Savannah gossip page had weighed in. Grace's sponsorships were suspended, her brand accounts locked, followers dropping by the thousands. The perfect daughter, the beloved face of Southern elegance, was now the headline scandal of the week. I read it all with an emotion I couldn't quite name, something between relief and grief. I made myself coffee and stood by the window. Across the parking lot, the river gleamed silver under the gray sky. I'd dreamed for years about them finally seeing the truth, and now that it was real, the victory felt empty. Truth doesn't heal it, only clears the wound so you can see how deep it goes. When the phone rang again, I almost ignored it. But the caller ID flashed: Mom. I stared at the name for a long second before answering. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice came through sharp and panicked. "Your sister's life is in ruins. Everyone's calling me, reporters, friends. What did you send him?" "Hannah." I closed my eyes. "Good morning to you too, Mom." "Don't you dare be flippant. Tell me the truth. Did you send that video?" "She sent it to herself," I said quietly. "She just didn't know it yet." Mom gasped, furious. "How can you talk like that? You've always been jealous, always waiting for her to stumble." "No," I said. "I was waiting for you to notice I was standing." The silence that followed was thick and trembling. "You're cruel," she finally whispered. "She's your sister." "And I'm your daughter," I replied. But that never seemed to matter as much. Her sobbing started, then broken and theatrical. "You'll regret this. You've destroyed this family." I stared at the rain streaking the glass. Maybe it needed to break before it could ever be real. I ended the call before she could answer. For a while, I just sat there, letting the quiet settle around me. The guilt came in soft waves, old habit. Then, as quickly as it came, it receded. What was done wasn't cruelty. It was truth finally allowed to breathe. That evening, the phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me slide my thumb across the screen. "Hi, Hannah." Ethan's voice was calm, low. "I hope it's okay that I called." My heart tightened. "It's fine," I said. He hesitated. "I wanted to thank you for the truth. I think I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to see it." I leaned against the wall. "You didn't deserve what happened." He exhaled softly. "Neither did you. I'm sorry for everything your family put you through. I didn't know what to say to that." "What will you do now?" "I'm leaving Savannah. I need to start over somewhere far away from all this." "Good," I said. "Some truths deserve distance." He chuckled softly, the sound warm and tired. "You know, when I met you the first time, I thought you were intimidating. Grace said you were cold." "I'm not cold," I said. "Just careful." "I know that now," he said. "Take care of yourself, Hannah. You too." When the line went dead, I realized my hands were steady. I hadn't noticed until that moment how often they used to tremble. 2 days passed before Grace showed up. I heard the knock just as I was packing to leave. It wasn't loud, just persistent. I opened the door to find her standing there, barefoot, hair unwashed, wearing an oversized sweatshirt that swallowed her frame. She looked like the ghost of her own perfection. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside. She walked to the center of the room, staring at nothing. "You're happy now, aren't you?" she said finally. "You got what you wanted." I closed my suitcase and sat on the edge of the bed. "What exactly do you think I wanted? You humiliated me in front of everyone. You made me look like a monster." I met her eyes. "You did that all by yourself." She laughed once bitterly. "You think you're so righteous, but you've always hated me. You couldn't stand that people loved me." I stood slowly. "I didn't hate you, Grace. I hated what loving you turned me into." She blinked, confused. "What does that even mean?" "It means I spent my whole life shrinking so you could shine. Every time Mom compared us, every time you took what was mine and called it yours, I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. You taught me that love was competition. I'm just finally opting out." She crossed her arms, but her voice trembled. "You sound just like them, selfish, cruel." "No," I said softly, "just done." "Do you have any idea what it's like to lose everything overnight?" "Yes," I said. "I lived that way for 30 years. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I don't know how to fix this." "Then stop trying to fix it," I said. "Start facing it." She looked at me like she didn't understand. "So what now? You get to be the good one." "There are no good ones here," I said. "Just people who finally stopped lying." She turned toward the door, voice small. "You really hate me, don't you?" I shook my head. "No, Grace. If I hated you, I wouldn't have sent the truth. I would have let you keep living the lie." She didn't answer. She just nodded once and left, closing the door softly behind her. The room felt impossibly still. I walked to the window, the rain gone now, leaving the world washed clean. The Savannah River shimmered under the last light of day, brown and gold, endless. I picked up my phone, saw more headlines, more speculation, more noise, and turned it off. For the first time in my life, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. I poured myself a glass of water, sat by the window, and breathed. Somewhere out there, my family was unraveling, but it wasn't my responsibility anymore. The truth had cost me them, yes, but it had given me back myself. As the sky darkened, lightning flickered far off across the marsh. I watched it dance on the horizon, faint and distant, a reminder that storms never really vanish. They just move on to other skies. I whispered to the quiet room. Maybe this is what freedom sounds like. And for the first time, I believed it. 2 months later, I could finally breathe without feeling the weight of other people's stories pressing on my chest. The Savannah scandal had burned itself out, leaving nothing but smoke and silence in its wake. I'd moved to Charleston, rented a small apartment near the water, and started over. The mornings smelled of salt and roasted coffee, and for the first time in years, I woke up without dread. My new office was a small PR agency that handled local artists and nonprofits. No glamour, no chaos, just real people trying to build something meaningful. It felt like oxygen. Most mornings I walked to the pier before work, coffee in hand, watching the fishermen cast their lines. The sun came up slow over the harbor, soft light touching everything it could reach. I liked that about this city. It didn't try to impress anyone. It just existed. One morning, as gulls circled overhead, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was an email notification. The subject line read "Interview Request, the sister who stayed silent." I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I could already imagine the words they wanted to turn the wreckage of my family into clicks and views. I deleted it without hesitation and blocked the sender. The truth wasn't for sale. I'd stopped following the news from Savannah, but the world has a way of finding you anyway. Ashley called one afternoon, her voice hushed the way people talk when they're carrying someone else's pain. "Grace's story's still everywhere," she said. She's lost all her sponsorships. The company she partnered with dropped her after the video hit 1 million views. I exhaled slowly. I figured. There's more, Ashley said. Your parents sold the house. Something about debts and medical bills. Grace moved into a small apartment downtown. She's working at a coffee shop apparently. I pictured her there, no cameras, no stylists, no attention, just an apron and a cash register. The image didn't bring satisfaction, only quiet. Are you okay hearing all this? Ashley asked. I'm okay, I said, and I meant it. The next weeks passed in peace. I began therapy again, this time not to survive but to understand. My therapist, a woman named Lena, had a way of asking questions that stripped away every excuse I'd ever built. What would you say to the younger version of yourself? She asked one day. I thought for a long time before answering. I'd tell her it wasn't her job to make everyone comfortable. Lena smiled softly. And what does the adult you need to hear? That peace doesn't mean silence, I said. It just means I finally stopped shouting into the wrong rooms. She nodded. That's growth, Hannah. I started joining a weekend group Lena hosted, women rebuilding boundaries after years of family manipulation. Most were older mothers or grandmothers who'd carried guilt longer than I'd been alive. One of them, a silver-haired woman named May, said something that stayed with me. Telling the truth doesn't destroy families. It reveals which bonds were real to begin with. That sentence followed me everywhere. On a Friday evening, after a long day at work, I was making tea when my phone rang again. The caller ID froze me in place. Grace. For several seconds, I just stared at the screen, watching it light up, fade, then ring again. Finally, I answered. Her voice was small, fragile. Hey. Hi, I said. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I wasn't sure I would either. There was a pause, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator. Then she said, I've been angry at you for so long, but now I just feel tired. Tired's not bad, I said quietly. It means you're starting to feel something real. She laughed, a soft, broken sound. I guess. I've been going to therapy. The doctor says I built my whole identity on being liked, that I don't know who I am without approval. That's an honest start. Yeah. She hesitated. Mom still won't talk about what happened. She acts like if she ignores it long enough, it'll unhappen. Dad barely speaks at all. Sounds about right. Another long silence. I could almost hear her breathing. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, but I wanted to tell you, I'm sorry, for everything. For being cruel when you were only trying to help. For pretending I was better. Her words landed softly like rain on dry earth. I didn't know if they came from guilt or growth, but maybe it didn't matter. I don't hate you, Grace, I said, but I can't go back to what we were. I know. We stayed on the line for another minute, saying nothing, just listening to each other's silence. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. When the call ended, I sat by the window watching the last light fade from the sky. The horizon glowed pink, fading into blue, the same colors from the day of her wedding. Except now, the world felt softer. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was something that unfolded quietly like the tide. The next morning I walked to the beach before sunrise. The air was cool, filled with the scent of salt and something new. I took off my shoes and stepped into the sand. The waves rolled in, touching my ankles, pulling back again. I thought of everything that had been taken from me, and everything I'd finally let go. Peace didn't feel like victory. It felt like stillness, like standing exactly where you were supposed to be. A fisherman nearby tossed his net into the water. The sun began to rise, spilling orange light across the waves. I reached down, picked up a smooth stone, and held it for a moment. Revenge gave me silence, I whispered. Truth gave me peace. I threw the stone into the surf and watched it disappear beneath the ripples. And peace doesn't need witnesses. I stood there until the tide reached my feet again. Somewhere far behind me, life waited emails, projects, people who didn't know my story and didn't need to. Ahead of me, the ocean stretched out endlessly, a promise and a warning all at once. I turned to leave, but something made me look back one last time. The waves rolled in, and just for a second, I thought I saw the stone again glinting under the water before the sea swallowed it completely. I smiled. I thought the waves had finished carrying my story away. But sometimes the tide brings back what you least expect. The letter came on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. It was sitting on the welcome mat outside my door. No return address, just my name, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, sharp, deliberate, distant. My heart slowed the moment I saw it. I hadn't heard from him since the wedding. I stood there for a long time, staring at the envelope like it might bite. When I finally opened it, the paper smelled faintly of tobacco and old wood. The message was short. "Your mother's not well. She's been asking for you. No love, Dad. No apology." Just a statement and a weight that dropped straight into my chest. I sat on the edge of my couch, letter in one hand, coffee cooling in the other. Outside, the early sunlight danced across the harbor. Inside, everything felt still, almost fragile. For the next hour, I didn't move. My mind flickered through memories like old film, her voice calling me ungrateful, her hand tightening around my wrist during arguments, the way she used to praise Grace in front of guests and scold me in private. Every scene felt like a wound that had never properly healed. I'd promised myself I'd never go back to that house, never breathe that air again. But the word mother still carried gravity, pulling at the softer parts of me. I folded the letter, set it on the counter, and tried to go about my day. But no matter how much I worked or cleaned or walked along the pier that evening, the thought followed me. What if this was the last chance to make peace? What if not going would haunt me more than returning ever could? That night I called Ashley. "You're not seriously thinking of going back there, are you?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "She's sick." Hannah, her tone softened. "They were sick long before that. You don't owe them anything. I know, but I don't think it's about owing anymore." Ashley sighed. "I just don't want you getting pulled back into their chaos." I smiled faintly. Maybe I just need to see if I'm immune to it now. Later, I brought the letter to my next session with Lena, my therapist. She read it silently, then looked up at me. "How do you feel when you see this conflicted?" I said. "Like a part of me wants to help and another part wants to burn it." "Maybe you don't need to do either," she said gently. "Sometimes going back isn't about them. It's about proving to yourself that the past can't control you anymore." Her words settled in quietly, like stones sinking through water. 2 days later, I packed an overnight bag and drove toward Savannah. The road stretched long and empty, framed by moss-draped oaks and the faint smell of rain. I hadn't made this drive since the day I left for college. The landscape was the same, but I wasn't. When I reached the city limits, I stopped at a small cafe near the old market square to stretch my legs. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals reading newspapers and the hum of soft jazz. I ordered coffee and sat by the window. That's when I saw her. Grace stood behind the counter, hair pulled into a messy bun apron dusted with flour. She looked up and froze. Our eyes met through the glass display of pastries, and for a second neither of us moved. Then she smiled, small, genuine, fragile. Hi, I said. "What are you doing here, just passing through?" She nodded, looked down, and reached for a paper cup. "Coffee's on the house," she said, voice quiet but steady. I wanted to ask how she was, but the question felt too heavy for the room. So I just said thank you and meant it. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed. The last time we'd touched, she was in a wedding gown screaming my name. Now she was calm, pale, and, maybe for the first time, real. "Take care, Grace," I said before leaving. "You too," she whispered. Outside, the air was cool and clean, like rain had just passed. I took a sip of the coffee and smiled faintly. It was strong, a little bitter, just right. The drive to my parents' house took less than 15 minutes, though it felt longer. The once grand colonial looked smaller. Now the paint chipped the yard unkempt. I parked under the magnolia tree and sat for a moment listening to the tick of the cooling engine. My hands didn't shake this time. When I knocked, the door opened slowly. Mom stood there, thinner than I remembered, her hair almost entirely gray. Her voice was small. "Hannah." "Hi, Mom." She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of old flowers and dust. The framed family photos still lined the hallway: Grace's graduation, my parents' anniversary, and one of me from years ago tucked in a corner like an afterthought. We sat in the living room. She kept smoothing her skirt, eyes darting around the room, as if the right words might be hiding somewhere in the furniture. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said finally. "I wasn't sure I would either." She gave a weak smile. "Your father said I should write. He thinks you hate us." I looked at the sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. "I don't hate anyone, Mom. I just stopped pretending everything was fine." Her eyes filled with tears. "I did what I thought was best. I was trying to protect the family." "You protected the image," I said softly, "not the people." She flinched but didn't argue. After a long silence, she whispered, "You were always the strong one. I just didn't know how to love you without feeling small." Something in my chest loosened like a knot slowly untangling. I reached across the space between us and touched her hand. It trembled under mine. For the first time, she didn't pull away. We sat like that for a while, not speaking. No dramatic apology, no absolution, just two women finally admitting how tired they were of hurting. When I stood to leave, she squeezed my hand, once weak but deliberate. "You look happy," she said. "I hope you really are." "I am," I said, and for the first time, it was true. Outside, the afternoon sun hung low, turning everything gold. The house looked smaller than ever, but it didn't scare me anymore. It was just a place where something once happened. I walked down to the river that ran behind the neighborhood. The same one I used to visit as a kid, when I needed to think. I pulled Dad's letter from my pocket, read it one last time, then let it slip from my fingers. The paper floated for a moment before the water carried it away. Some doors don't close with anger. They close quietly when you stop waiting for an apology that will never come. I stood there until the sun began to sink, warm light reflecting off the ripples like gold shards. Somewhere behind me, the house windows glowed with fading light. I turned and walked back to my car. The wind smelled of salt and memory, but it no longer hurt. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the road behind me disappearing into the distance. I didn't know what waited ahead, but I felt ready for it. What I didn't know was that as the river carried my father's letter away, something else was already on its way back to me. The email arrived on a quiet Friday morning. I was sitting by the window finishing my second cup of coffee when the notification blinked across my screen. The subject line was short and strange enough to make me freeze. "No hard feelings, Ethan." For a full minute, I just stared at it. My first instinct was to delete it without reading. I'd built too much peace to risk letting the past back in. But something in the phrasing, calm, almost kind, made me click. The message was simple. He wrote that he'd left Savannah, that he was living in Asheville now, working at a small medical clinic. He talked about hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains on weekends, about how quiet the mornings were up there. Then one line stopped me cold. "Sometimes the truth hurts just enough to set us free. Thank you for being brave when I wasn't." That was it. No signature, no questions, no expectation. Just truth meeting truth. I read the message 3 times, each slower than the last. My pulse didn't race. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt an ache that was strangely gentle, a sadness wrapped in gratitude. I remembered the moment he'd walked out of the wedding, the hush that fell over the crowd, the way the light hit his face, as if the universe itself had exhaled for him. Back then it felt like chaos. Now it felt like release for both of us. I closed my laptop and stood by the window. Outside, Charleston was golden and still. I thought about how far I'd come from that woman, on the edge of heartbreak and rage. I didn't want to undo anything, but I also didn't want to leave that message unanswered. That evening, I opened a new email draft. My fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than I expected. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like reopening an old wound? Eventually, I just started typing. Hi, Ethan. I wasn't sure what to feel when I saw your message. I guess relief is the closest word. I'm glad you're doing well. Life's been quiet here. Good quiet. I've been working at a small PR firm helping artists and nonprofits tell their stories. It feels right to be around truth now, even in small ways. You said the truth set us free. Maybe it did. I don't regret what happened anymore. It made room for honesty, and that's something rare. Take care of yourself. I stared at the screen, rereading the lines, tempted to delete them all. But for once, I didn't overthink. I hit send. Not because I hoped for a reply, but because it felt right to close the circle. Days passed. I didn't check my inbox obsessively like I once would have. Instead, I spent my time in the city's rhythm, morning walks by the harbor, dinners with coworkers, evenings painting on my balcony just to fill the air with color. Peace, I was learning, wasn't a feeling. It was a practice. A week later, I walked into my favorite cafe on the waterfront to escape the afternoon heat. I just ordered when someone behind me said, "Still taking your coffee, black, I see." The voice froze me in place. I turned. Ethan stood there, casual in jeans and a navy button-down, a travel bag slung over one shoulder. His hair was longer, his face leaner, but the steadiness in his eyes was the same. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," he replied. "I was passing through on my way to Jacksonville. Thought I'd see if you actually existed or if I'd made you up." "I exist," I said. "Just quieter now." He smiled. "You look different." "Better or worse, real," he said simply. We sat by the window, the same kind of sunlight that once watched us fall apart now spilling across our table. The conversation flowed easily, like time hadn't built walls between us. He told me about Asheville, the new job, how he'd stopped checking social media altogether. "I didn't realize how much noise I'd let into my head," he said. "Now I wake up, make coffee, go hiking. No drama, no audience." I nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How peace feels like boredom at first until you realize it's just space." He looked at me thoughtfully. "You always understood things before anyone else. I just didn't listen." "You weren't ready," I said. "Maybe neither of us was." We both laughed softly. There was no bitterness left, just recognition. At one point, he leaned back and said, "I used to think what happened at the wedding ruined everything. But maybe it saved us from living a lie." "Maybe," I said. "I think truth has its own mercy. It just doesn't look like it at first." The waitress refilled our cups, and for a few moments, we just watched the sunlight glitter across the river. It struck me how unremarkable this moment was, and how beautiful that made it. When it was time for him to leave, he stood and hesitated. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just wanted to see you to know you're okay." "I am," I said. "I hope you are too." He nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally am." We hugged briefly, no tension, no unspoken longing, just warmth. Then he picked up his bag, gave me a small smile, and walked out into the late afternoon light. I sat there for a while, watching him disappear into the crowd. My chest felt both full and light, like I'd just exhaled something I didn't know I'd been holding on to. Later, I walked along the harbor. The sky had turned soft pink, the kind of color that doesn't ask to be noticed. A gentle breeze lifted my hair, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. People think peace is an ending, but it's not. It's the quiet space that lets something new begin. I leaned against the railing, listening to the waves lap against the dock, and thought about all the versions of myself that had existed in the last year. The angry one, the heartbroken one, the brave one, the quiet one. For the first time, I loved all of them. Every mistake, every confrontation, every tear had built the woman standing here now. As the sun sank below the horizon, a calm settled in me that didn't feel temporary. Revenge had given me silence. Truth had given me peace. And peace, real peace, didn't need witnesses. I turned toward home, smiling to myself as the streetlights flickered on one by one. I once thought revenge was my story. Turns out it was just the prologue. A year had passed, though sometimes it felt like an entire lifetime. Charleston was bright that morning, the kind of heat that carried salt in the air and sunlight that lingered on your skin. I sat by my window watering the plants I'd somehow managed to keep alive, a small jungle of green that had grown along with me. For the first time, the calendar didn't scare me. No anniversaries to dread. No silence waiting to explode. Just days ordinary and mine. At work, things had shifted too. The small PR firm had expanded, and I'd been promoted to lead a project helping women rebuild their careers after personal or public crises. It felt almost poetic standing on the other side of the same kind of wreckage that once swallowed me whole. Every story we took on carried its own kind of redemption. I used to think healing meant distance from the pain, but now I knew it meant transforming it into something that could help someone else breathe again. One of the women in my program was barely 25. Her name was Emily, and she'd been ostracized by her family after coming forward about a toxic workplace scandal. She reminded me of myself at that age, trying too hard to appear unbothered, holding her pain like a secret badge of strength. During one of our sessions, she asked, "How do you stop feeling guilty for telling the truth?" I smiled. "You don't. You just get used to knowing that guilt doesn't mean you were wrong. Truth doesn't make you cruel, Emily. It makes you clear." She nodded, tears threatening to fall, and I saw the exact moment her shoulders dropped, the weight starting to slip off. Watching her find her voice reminded me why I'd chosen this life, why walking through fire had been worth it. The pain had been a currency. Now I was finally spending it on something good. It was late May when Grace appeared again. I didn't know she was in Charleston until I saw her name on the RSVP list for a women's leadership event my company was hosting. For a long time I stared at the name tag being printed with hers, half expecting it to be a prank. But when she walked through the glass doors that afternoon wearing a simple white blouse and jeans, I knew it was real. She looked older, not worn, but softer. Life had humbled her in ways pride never could. When our eyes met across the room, the noise faded, replaced by the familiar ache of something half forgotten. After the panel ended, she approached me slowly, cautious but unafraid. "Hi, Hannah." "Hi, Grace." She smiled nervously. "I didn't know if you'd recognize me." "I'd recognize you anywhere." We found a quiet corner near the balcony where the late sun turned the room honey gold. For a while, neither of us spoke. The city hummed below, steady and alive. "I've been following your work," she said finally. "You're doing amazing things. Thank you." She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not the kind that fixes everything, just the kind that tells the truth." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "I used to think you ruined me," she continued. "But maybe you freed me too. I had to lose everything to see how much of my life was built on pretending." I let the words settle before I answered. "We both had to lose everything to find ourselves." Grace exhaled shakily, and for the first time in forever, she looked like my sister, not the golden one, not the rival, just a woman standing in the same light. We didn't hug. We didn't promise to rebuild what was gone. We simply smiled, two survivors of the same storm, quietly grateful to still be standing. When she left, I stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched below me, bathed in the warm glow of dusk. I realized then that peace wasn't the absence of connection. It was knowing which connections could survive truth. Grace and I had found ours, not loud, not perfect, but real. Later that week, I moved into a new apartment, a few blocks closer to the harbor. It had a tiny balcony where sunlight poured in every morning, and I'd filled it with plants, ferns, herbs, and a small lilac bush I'd found at a market. Mom used to love lilacs. I planted it not out of nostalgia, but as a quiet way of forgiving without words. Each morning, I'd water it carefully, feeling the roughness of the soil against my fingers, the scent of new life rising. Watching it bloom became my daily reminder that growth doesn't require approval. It just requires sunlight and time. One morning, as I trimmed a few dry leaves, I found myself whispering to the plant, "You can't control who loves you, but you can grow anyway." The words felt truer than any prayer I'd ever said. My work kept me busy, but not in the hollow way it used to. I taught workshops, spoke at small conferences, and mentored women who were learning how to own their voices. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they laughed, but always they left lighter. I remember one evening after a long event, sitting on the balcony with a glass of wine. The city was alive below, music drifting from nearby bars, couples walking hand in hand. The air smelled of rain and jasmine. I opened my journal and began to write. I used to think peace was quiet, but it's not. It's the soft hum that comes after the chaos, the sound of your own heart finally believing it's safe. I paused, watching the lights shimmer across the water. Then I wrote another line. I thought I'd spend my life proving my worth. But peace isn't about being chosen, it's about choosing yourself. I set the pen down and smiled, realizing I didn't need anyone else to read these words for them to matter. The lilac on the balcony swayed gently in the wind, the petals glowing under the streetlights. I took a sip of wine, leaning against the railing. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, marking the hour. I'd spent years waiting for storms, expecting the sky to fall, the floor to give way, the people I loved to disappear. But now I wasn't waiting for anything. The world was still unpredictable, yes, but I was rooted strong enough to weather whatever came next. As the night deepened, I whispered to the quiet I used to live, waiting for the storm. Now I plant my roots where the sun finds me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The morning light slipped quietly through the curtains, painting thin gold lines across my bed. Outside, the city was just waking up, the sound of gulls, a dog barking somewhere, the slow hum of the first bus passing down the street. It had been exactly a year since I returned to Savannah, since I faced the last ghosts of that house and finally closed the door behind me. Back then, I thought peace would feel like fireworks. Instead, it came like this soft, ordinary, and real. The kind of silence that used to terrify me now felt like home. I poured coffee and stepped onto the balcony. The air carried the faint smell of salt and something sweet from the cafe below. The lilac bush I'd planted had bloomed overnight, pale violet petals against the dark green leaves. It made me smile. There was a time when everything beautiful made me suspicious, like I didn't deserve it. Now I just let beauty be what it was. A year ago, I believed revenge would heal me, that exposing the truth would fill the hollow places my family had carved out of me. But what I learned was simpler, harder, and infinitely truer. The truth doesn't fill you. It empties you of illusions, of guilt, of the need to be understood. And in that emptiness, something pure finally grows. Some mornings I still think about it. All the phone call that started everything, the flight to Miami, the quiet terror of discovering the truth, the chaos that followed. But now those memories come like distant thunder, a sound I can recognize without flinching. Everything that burned had meaning. Every storm that tore through my life left space for sunlight. If none of it had happened, I'd still be fighting for a seat at a table that was never built for me. I've learned to stop asking why people fail to love you the way you deserve. Sometimes the answer is simply that they can't. And that doesn't make you unworthy, it just means you were never meant to live in their small idea of love. On my desk sits a letter I wrote but never sent, addressed to the girl I used to be. I pick it up sometimes, reading the words to remind myself how far I've come. Dear me, you were never difficult. You were never too much. You were just born with a heart that refused to shrink to fit inside other people's comfort zones. You tried to earn love by being useful, quiet, forgiving, but love isn't a trophy, and forgiveness isn't a leash. You didn't lose your family. You found yourself. And one day when peace arrives, you'll realize it was never about being chosen. It was about choosing yourself. I fold the letter back into its envelope, though I no longer need the reminder. She, the girl I was, does. Somewhere, in another time, she's still trying to be enough. I hope she reads these words through the years and knows she made it here. In the afternoons, I walk to the beach. It's never the same twice. The waves change shape with every tide. The color of the sky never repeats itself. Today, the sand is warm beneath my feet, and the water shimmers like glass. Children run along the shore, laughing, their footprints erased as quickly as they're made. One little boy catches my attention. He's building a sandcastle near the edge of the water, working fast, piling towers and bridges. Every time a wave washes it away, he laughs, not cries, and starts again. The sight makes something ache and bloom inside me at once. Life will always rebuild itself if you let it. I sit down a few feet away, watching the tide creep closer. When I first came here months ago, I used to bring my journal, trying to write meaning into every detail. Now, I just breathe it in. The rhythm of the sea has taught me something important: you can't hold still what's meant to move. As the sun begins to lower, I whisper to the horizon, I forgive you. I'm not sure who I'm saying it to: my family, my sister, myself, but it doesn't matter. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It's a quiet surrender of the past. I walk closer to the water, letting the waves curl around my ankles. The wind smells like freedom. I close my eyes and think of every version of me that once stood on a shore like this, angry, grieving, terrified. I wish I could reach back and tell her, you survive. You become more than survival. For a long time, I stand there listening to the ocean, breathing in and out the same way I've learned to. Peace, I've realized, doesn't shout. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or closure or applause. It comes quietly, when you finally stop asking, why me, and start whispering, thank you. The people who hurt you will go on their way, and so will you. The difference is, you'll carry truth instead of pain. Truth is lighter. It travels better. As the last light fades, the waves turn silver, catching the reflection of the moon. I think of Grace sometimes, not with anger anymore, just curiosity. She sends postcards now and then, short notes from new cities. The last one said, I'm learning to live without pretending. You taught me that. I smiled when I read it. That's the thing about truth, it echoes. It ripples outward long after the initial sound is gone. The air cools, the sky deepens to indigo. I walk back up the beach, leaving footprints that the next tide will take. Behind me, the sea keeps moving, steady and endless like time itself. I stop at the edge of the boardwalk and look back one last time. The moonlight dances on the water, and I feel something I can't name: gratitude, maybe. For the storms, for the endings, for the peace that grew from everything that broke. I used to think revenge would fix what was broken, but all it ever did was clear the path for truth. And truth gave me peace. The tide always returns, but so does the Sunday. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you're still standing in your own storm, wondering if peace will ever find you. If my story found you tonight, tell me, what truth are you still afraid to face? Sometimes saying it out loud is the first step towards setting yourself free. And if you believe, like I do now, that peace begins with honesty, stay with me. Like, share, subscribe, and tell me your story. Because somewhere out there, someone's waiting to hear it, and maybe your truth will be the light that brings them home.